Sherlock fans across the world have formed societies dedicated to preserving his legacy and honoring his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Did you know that Minnesota has one of its own Sherlockian societies called the Norwegian Explorers? In this episode, we will explore how this society was started, what they do, and why their society is more than just a fan club. It all started back in 1948, when professors at the University of Minnesota realized they were all huge fans of Sherlock Holmes. They saw an opportunity to bring together other fans in Minnesota, so they got permission from a well-known Sherlock Holmes group called the Baker Street Irregulars to start a Minnesota chapter. To learn more about the society's history and their recent efforts to keep the spirit of Sherlock alive, I spoke with two Norwegian explorers, Julie McCurris and Dick Sveum. Where does the name Norwegian Explorers come from?
Most of the societies that are devoted to Sherlock Holmes pick a name from somewhere within the stories. It might be a story title, such as the Red Circle of Washington, or it just might be a phrase or an item that's listed in it. When the Norwegian Explorers were formed in 1948, the 5 academics who were behind it chose several potential names for the group, but one ended up as the one, and that was the Norwegian Explorers. And that comes from a phrase that Sherlock Holmes uses after a 3-year hiatus. He tells Dr. Watson, "You may have read of the explorations of a Norwegian explorer named Sigerson." And the person we believe came up with the idea of the Norwegian Explorers was Theodore Blagen, who taught Scandinavian history and immigration.
What makes the Norwegian Explorers different from other fan clubs is their emphasis on studying and exploring Sherlock Holmes. From day one, the group has been dedicated to delving deeper into the world of the famous detective, publishing works, founding a journal, and hosting conferences to share their findings with others. The group's founders were true innovators in their field, leaving a lasting impact on the appreciation and understanding of Sherlock Holmes. I've heard that you've done some research on Sherlock Holmes. What's some of the most interesting research that you have done?
I think the most interesting research I've done, along with several other people, was on William Baring Gould. Baring Gould was an employee of Time Life magazines, but I think he considered his real interest Sherlock Holmes. He was originally from Minneapolis and was an alumni of the University of Minnesota and was always interested in backing the university. When he died, his widow donated his papers and manuscripts to the university, so that was the basis for the research. I also went to New York, went to view the Time Life archives and see the papers he wrote, the presentations he made. And one other thing I did was I tracked down his daughter. So I went to visit her. And she was so pleased that people remembered her father. It was like, oh yes, people remember your father. And basically build upon his work. Part of the unanswered questions came because there weren't very many people I could talk to who knew him. He died at a fairly young age in 1967, just shortly before the annotated Sherlock Holmes was published. It did go ahead, they did publish it. In terms of people who knew him, who could describe him to me, I found very few people. Luckily, there were some recordings where I could listen to him speak, and his sense of humor and just joy in all of this came through. When I interviewed his daughter, she really reinforced that. But he passed away when she was college age. Finding someone who knew him as an adult was a little more difficult.
Can you talk a little bit about the social connections that you've made as being a member of the Norwegian Explorers?
When I first joined the group, it was interesting because we were like-minded people, and I was more interested in the stories and the details, and I wasn't looking to make a lot of friends, and the friendships just happened. From the local group, I ended up joining a national group called the Baker Street Irregulars that meets in New York City every year on the Friday closest to January the 6th. And then from that group, I was able to meet quite a few people, and then international people. So I'm a member of the Reichenbach Irregulars, which is a club out of Switzerland. I belong to the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And I've met people from India, from Japan, from all over the world that share an interest in Sherlock Holmes, the character.
I hear you have a copy of your grandfather's book, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Can you tell me a bit more about your grandfather and this book?
Sure. In fact, I brought the book with me. It's pretty beat up because I've been carrying it around since my grandfather died. My grandfather was Olaf Sveum. He was born in 1886, the same year as the Sherlock Holmes character made its appearance. Born in Norway, immigrated to South Dakota on a farm, and then worked his way through railroad and streetcars to Minneapolis and grew up there on the north side. He had one son named Arthur, which I find intriguing because of Arthur Conan Doyle. And when I was about 12, when I discovered Sherlock Holmes, I found in his house on Newton Avenue this book, which was a 1902 edition of Hound of the Baskervilles. My grandfather, Olaf, had this book at his house. And after he passed, I inherited the book and had it with me ever since. So it really means a lot to me.
What does it mean to you to find this book and realize that you have this sort of multi-generational connection to Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah, well, so that whole thing is interesting. Most people discover Sherlock Holmes when they're sort of half a boy and half a man. So when I was 12 years old, we used to watch Matinee Movie, which had the old Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes. And I go, oh, Sherlock Holmes. There was also a Minneapolis Public Library within a block of my house, and I discovered that there was a thing called The Complete Sherlock Holmes. So I brought that book home, read it cover to cover, and then I discovered this at my grandfather's house, and it all just sort of connected up. Multi-generational is an interesting question. Although my father's name was Arthur, he really wasn't a Sherlockian. He was a chemist, worked for General Mills, and was a photographer. It skips generations. I have 4 children. None of them are very interested in Sherlock Holmes, but I have 6 grandchildren that all know about Sherlock Holmes. So it probably skips generations, but it is multi-generational.
What is the Norwegian explorer's legacy? What do you think they have contributed to our understanding of Sherlock Holmes and the genre?
The legacy, as I see it, is that we're trying to keep the memory green of the master. The idea that Sherlock Holmes was real, Watson wrote the stories, and Arthur Conan Doyle was a literary agent. We do that through our meetings and discussing the canon. We even have a study group that meets and goes through story by story and have discussion about that story. And then, more importantly, is that because the founders of the Norwegian explorers were all university professors, we've had this connection university, they were able to help establish the Sherlock Holmes collections at the University of Minnesota, which now has grown enormously and is trying to be the world center for the study of Sherlock Holmes and related material.
The Norwegian explorers of Minnesota have left their mark not just in the world of Sherlock Holmes, but in Minnesota's history as well. In our next and final episode, we'll delve deeper into the Norwegian explorers' lasting legacy, examining the Sherlock Holmes collections at the University of Minnesota. The game is afoot.